The human brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. At its core, it is designed to recognize, anticipate, and respond to patterns. Every action we take, and every decision we make, and every habit we form is underpinned by the brain's drive to reduce uncertainty and create stability in its environment. When you understand this, it becomes clear why consistency is so powerful. It provides the brain with a reliable framework to work within. And when the brain encounters consistency, it becomes more efficient, more focused, and ultimately more productive. Neurons that fire together wire together. This simple principle, known as Hebbian learning, explains how behaviors become automatic over time. When you engage in a behavior repeatedly, waking up at the same time, practicing a skill daily, dedicating specific hours to deep work, you are reinforcing specific neural pathways. These pathways become more efficient, requiring less cognitive effort to activate. This is how habits are formed on a biological level. It's not just about willpower or discipline. It's about creating physical changes in the brain that make future repetitions easier. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to be consistent is waiting until they feel like it. They rely on motivation, which is inherently unreliable because it fluctuates based on sleep, mood, environment, and even blood sugar levels. But the brain doesn't need to feel good to perform well. It simply needs repetition. When you do something consistently, your brain begins to expect that action. And when the brain expects a behavior, it starts preparing the body for it in advance. This is known as anticipatory regulation. For example, if you always study or train at 700 a.m., your brain will begin adjusting your alertness, hormone levels, and focus as that time approaches. It's similar to how you start to feel sleepy at a consistent bedtime, even without looking at the clock. Your brain has built a predictive model around your behavior. This is why starting a new routine can feel hard at first, but becomes easier with time. The brain begins to automate the behavior, reducing the energy cost associated with it. This automation has enormous benefits. When your brain no longer has to negotiate with itself every day, should I go to the gym? Should I open that book? Should I start that project? You conserve mental energy. You reduce decision fatigue, which is one of the major contributors to procrastination and inconsistency. Instead of expending cognitive resources on whether to act, you can use that energy on the action itself. Over time, your identity begins to shift. You no longer have to force yourself to be the kind of person who practices or performs. You simply become that person because the brain has structurally adapted to the behavior. There is also a powerful emotional component to this process. Consistency provides a sense of control and stability. When your days are anchored by predictable routines, your nervous system relaxes. You reduce anxiety because the brain is no longer dealing with constant unpredictability. This calm foundation allows for greater focus, better memory, and improved decision-making, all of which feed back into your ability to be consistent. It becomes a reinforcing cycle, biologically and behaviorally. In this way, consistency is not a personality trait you're born with. It's not a matter of being disciplined or motivated by nature. It's a skill you train. And the brain, when properly guided through repetition and structure, will adapt accordingly. The most successful people aren't those who are constantly inspired. They're the ones who have built a neural infrastructure that supports consistent action, whether or not they feel like it on a given day. You don't need to feel ready. You need to start training your brain to recognize the pattern, force the pattern at first, and soon it will start to feel automatic. That's when you'll know your brain has learned the rhythm. That's when consistency becomes your default. Most people misunderstand how motivation works. They assume they need to feel inspired, energized, or emotionally ready before taking action. This belief traps them in cycles of inaction because internal states like motivation are highly unstable. They fluctuate based on countless factors: sleep quality, nutrition, stress, even the weather. If you depend on those factors to align perfectly before doing meaningful work, you'll rarely show up consistently. The truth, grounded in neurobiology, is that action precedes motivation, not the other way around. At the center of this discussion is dopamine, a neurotransmitter often referred to as the motivation molecule. But dopamine is not about pleasure, it's about pursuit. It's released in anticipation of something rewarding, and it fuels goal-directed behavior. What's crucial to understand is that dopamine is not just triggered by the achievement of a goal, but by the process of striving toward it. More importantly, recent research shows that dopamine release often follows voluntary action. In other words, you don't act because you're motivated. You become motivated because you acted. When you initiate effort, whether it's starting a workout, writing a single sentence, or sitting down to focus, you stimulate brain regions associated with action and forward movement, such as the basal ganglia and prefrontal cortex. This activity signals the midbrain to begin releasing dopamine, which in turn reinforces the behavior you just performed. It's a feedback loop. You act, dopamine is released, you feel a sense of momentum, and that momentum makes you more likely to act again, the signals you give it. But the key is that it starts with you choosing to act, even when you don't feel like it. This is especially important in the early stages of forming a habit or building consistency. In the beginning, there's very little dopamine available for the task itself. That's why it feels so difficult to get started. But when you push through that resistance, even for just a few minutes, you begin training the brain to associate that action with a sense of progress. Over time, your brain starts to preload dopamine before the task begins because it has learned to anticipate the reward that follows. This is how you build internal momentum. Think of it like warming up an engine. The first few minutes may feel sluggish, uncertain, even uncomfortable. But as you move forward, the system catches on. Dopamine increases, focus sharpens, and what felt like friction becomes flow. People often wait for perfect moment to start. The moment when they feel dialed in or emotionally pumped. But those moments are rare. And more importantly, they are not required. What's required is your willingness to move and to trust that the neurochemistry will catch up. This principle applies across domains: fitness, learning, creativity, discipline. The person who laces up their shoes and walks out the door when it's cold and dark is not necessarily more motivated than the person who stays in bed. They've just learned to act independent of how they feel. They've trained their nervous system to understand that action creates energy, not the other way around. It's also worth noting that dopamine is involved in long-term reinforcement. Every time you take action despite low motivation, your brain is recording that data. It begins to form a prediction. When I do this, I feel better afterward. Over time, your baseline motivation for that task increases. You give it because the brain now views it as something that leads to a positive outcome. The task doesn't necessarily become easier. You just experience less resistance going into it. This flips the entire framework of motivation on its head. Instead of waiting for it, you generate it. Instead of chasing the right mood, you create the right biology through behavior. It's a shift from being reactive to being proactive with your mind and body. And it's the only reliable way to build consistency over time. So if you're looking to become consistent, stop asking how to feel more motivated. Instead, start asking, what action can I take right now, regardless of how I feel? Take that step. The dopamine will follow. The motivation will grow. And eventually, the behavior will feel like second nature. That's not luck or willpower. That's biology doing its job. But you have to go first. When it comes to building consistency, one of the most overlooked but powerful factors is your environment. People tend to blame themselves for lacking willpower or discipline, but what they often fail to recognize is how much their surroundings are either working for them or against them. The brain is constantly responding to cues, visual, auditory, and sensory signals that shape your behavior often below the level of conscious awareness. If your environment is filled with distractions, friction, or ambiguity, it becomes incredibly difficult to stay consistent, no matter how strong your intentions are. Friction is any form of resistance that makes a behavior harder to initiate or sustain. It can be physical, like having to dig through a pile of clutter to find your workout gear, or digital, like keeping social media apps on your home screen when you're trying to focus. It can even be emotional, such as associating your workspace with anxiety or past failures. What's key to understand is that the brain naturally avoids friction. It conserves energy and seeks the path of least resistance. This isn't laziness. It's biological efficiency. That means if something is just slightly harder to do, you'll subconsciously avoid it. You might think it's only an extra few steps, or I'll just do it later. But what's really happening is that your brain is being subtly repelled by the added resistance. On the flip side, if you reduce friction and make desired behaviors easier to access, the likelihood of doing them increases dramatically, not because your motivation increased, but because you removed the obstacles. So, how do you apply this? By engineering your environment so that the consistent action you want to take becomes the easiest and most obvious choice. Let's say you want to journal every morning. Instead of keeping your notebook in a drawer, leave it open on your desk with a pen on top. If you want to exercise first thing in the morning, lay out your clothes and shoes the night before. Want to cut back on screen time? Move your phone charger to another room and leave a book by your bedside instead. These small, strategic choices reduce the number of decisions your brain has to make, and that's crucial because decision fatigue is real. Every decision you make throughout the day draws from a limited pool of cognitive energy. The more choices you face, especially early in the day, the more that pool gets depleted. This is why people often fail to stay consistent after work or in the evenings. They've spent the entire day managing tasks, obligations, and input, and their brain is tired. By simplifying your environment and removing unnecessary decisions, you preserve mental bandwidth and reduce the friction required to start. Another important aspect of environment is association. Your brain forms connections between spaces and behaviors. If you always work from your bed, your brain begins to associate that space with both rest and effort, which leads to confusion and inefficiency. But if you designate clear spaces for specific tasks, a corner for reading, a desk for working, a bench for training, your brain responds with greater clarity and focus. The moment you enter that space, the appropriate mental state begins to emerge because the environment itself cues it. This environmental cueing system is especially helpful when building new habits. Your surroundings serve as a prompt. You don't have to rely entirely on internal will. The context itself nudges you toward the behavior. Over time, these cues become stronger and more automatic, reinforcing your consistency without requiring constant conscious effort. Ultimately, consistency doesn't live in your head alone. It lives in your systems, and your environment is one of the most powerful systems you control. Instead of relying on motivation to drag you through resistance, you can proactively design your surroundings to remove that resistance altogether. When you lower friction and make the right behavior the easiest option, consistency stops being a struggle and starts becoming second nature. Your brain and body are not designed to operate at full capacity all day long. Instead, they function in predictable cycles of energy, focus, and fatigue known as Ultradian rhythms. These cycles typically last around 90 to 120 minutes, and during each cycle, your nervous system ramps up to a peak of alertness and then naturally begins to decline. Ignoring this rhythm and pushing through mental fatigue can lead to decreased performance, poor focus, and long-term burnout. But if you understand and align with these cycles, you can unlock a powerful tool for building consistency and sustaining high-level performance over time. Most people are familiar with circadian rhythms, the roughly 24-hour cycle that governs sleep and wakefulness. But within the circadian rhythm are shorter ultradian cycles that regulate how alert or tired you feel throughout the day. These cycles are driven by a complex interplay of neural activity, hormonal release, and autonomic nervous system states. When you are in the peak of an ultradian cycle, Your brain is highly focused, and your ability to process information, learn, and make decisions is significantly enhanced. During the trough, or the dip, your body naturally seeks recovery, whether through rest, movement, or disengagement. This matters because if you're trying to force consistency in a state of cognitive or physical depletion, you are working against your biology. You're asking your brain to focus when it's already signaling a need to reset. That's why many people struggle with attention, discipline, or mental clarity, not because they're incapable, but because they're operating out of sync with their natural energy rhythms. Instead of trying to push through the entire day with steady effort, you should identify and protect 190 Ultradian window, during which you do your most important, focused work. This could be writing, deep problem solving, training, or studying. Anything that requires cognitive or physical intensity. When you dedicate the same time block each day to this type of effort, you begin to train your nervous system to ramp up its performance during that specific window. Over time, your body will begin preparing in advance. Cortisol, norepinephrine, and dopamine levels will naturally rise, sharpening focus and readiness without you needing to hype yourself up. This principle is similar to strength training or conditioning. You don't train your entire body all day long. You have focused periods of high effort, followed by recovery. Mental performance works the same way. If you train your mind to show up consistently during a specific window, you're building a mental muscle of presence and output. Over time, it becomes automatic. The challenge is that people often scatter their attention throughout the day. They check email constantly, switch between tasks, or allow interruptions to dictate their schedule. This fragments focus and prevents deep work. But by protecting one 90-minute window and treating it as non-negotiable, you not only harness your ultradian rhythm, but also develop psychological discipline. It becomes a daily anchor for consistency. This doesn't mean the rest of your day is unproductive, but that your highest leverage work, the kind that moves the needle, is prioritized during the peak of your brain's natural rhythm. Once you complete that window, you can allow for rest or lower intensity tasks in line with the recovery phase of the cycle. Furthermore, when your brain begins to recognize this rhythm, it becomes easier to initiate work. You're no longer warming up for long periods or wrestling with distraction. Instead, your nervous system expects effort during that time and responds accordingly. You're not just creating a habit. You're creating a neurophysiological state optimized for consistency and performance. In a world that demands constant productivity, aligning with your ultradian rhythm is a form of strategic discipline. You stop fighting your biology and start using it. That's how you force consistency in a sustainable way, not working harder all day, but by working smarter during the windows your body is naturally built for. Most people assume that their emotional state must align with their goals in order to act. They think they need to feel motivated, focused, or confident before they can start doing something meaningful. But this assumption is flawed. Emotional states are real, but they are not reliable. They fluctuate based on sleep, stress, hormones, environment, and even subtle subconscious cues. If you wait to feel, right, before taking action, you give your emotions control over your behavior. And that's a dangerous position to be in if you want to be consistent. The truth is that emotional states are not directives. They are signals, but they are not orders. You can feel tired and still perform. You can feel anxious and still speak. You can feel unmotivated and still show up. The ability to take action despite how you feel is one of the most important psychological muscles you can build. And like any muscle, it strengthens with repetition. Think of your emotional state as background noise. It's always there, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but it doesn't need to drive your behavior. What matters is learning to separate your of feeling state from your of action system. Your limbic system, the emotional brain, may be signaling discomfort, resistance, or boredom, but your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning and execution, can override it. When you practice overriding emotional resistance with consistent action, you develop self-regulation, and self-regulation is the foundation of discipline. This doesn't mean ignoring your emotions or suppressing them. It means acknowledging them and choosing to act anyway. There's a critical difference between letting your feelings control you and being aware of them while still taking purposeful steps. For example, if you feel overwhelmed by a task, the instinct is to avoid it. But if you simply start with a tiny step, opening your laptop, writing one sentence, or putting on your workout clothes, you engage the action circuitry in your brain. This sends a signal back to your emotional system that says, "We're doing this." Often, the emotional resistance begins to fade once action is underway. There is a deep neurobiological reason for this. Action triggers changes in the brain. It shifts your autonomic nervous system from a passive state to an active one. Your heart rate increases slightly, your attention narrows, and your brain starts to release neuromodulators like dopamine and norepinephrine, chemicals that increase alertness and motivation. The shift doesn't happen before action, it happens because of action. So even if you start in a low energy emotional state, the act of moving forward can pull you into a more focused and motivated state. It's also important to remember that emotional discomfort is often a signal of growth. When you stretch yourself, physically, mentally, or emotionally, your brain will generate resistance. It wants to keep you in familiar patterns because that feels safe. But that resistance doesn't mean you're on the wrong path. In fact, it often means you're right where you need to be. Learning to act in the presence of emotional discomfort is how you expand your capacity. You teach your brain that discomfort is not danger. It's part of the process. The people who are consistent over long periods are not the ones who always feel great. They're the ones who have built the habit of showing up regardless of how they feel. They've trained their brain to understand that emotions are inputs, not instructions. And they've created a gap, a small but powerful space between how they feel and what they choose to do. That space is where real discipline lives. It's where consistency is forged, not in moments of high energy or perfect clarity, but in the quiet, often uncomfortable decision to act in the face of resistance. The more you practice this, the more automatic it becomes. Your brain starts to learn, even when I feel off, I still follow through. That becomes part of your identity. And once it's part of your identity, consistency is no longer something you have to force. It's just who you are. One of the most powerful yet underrated forces behind consistency is identity. The actions you take each day are not just about achieving goals. They are reinforcing or weakening your sense of self to the signals you give it. Every time you choose to follow through on a commitment, especially when it's difficult, you are not just completing a task. You are casting a vote for the type of person you believe you are. Over time, those votes accumulate. They shape your self-image, your confidence, and ultimately, your level of consistency. Most people try to change their behavior by focusing on the outcome. They say, I want to lose weight, or I want to build a business, or I want to be productive. But they skip over the most important step, asking who they need to become in order to make that outcome inevitable. You don't become consistent by chasing results. You become consistent by deciding, I'm the type of person who shows up no matter what. And then you act in alignment with that identity every single day, even if it's in small ways. The human brain is wired to seek congruence between identity and behavior. When your actions are aligned with your self-image, there's a sense of internal coherence. But when there's a gap, when you act in ways that contradict the person you believe you are, the brain experiences discomfort. This is called cognitive dissonance, and the brain will do one of two things to resolve it. It will either adjust your behavior to match your identity, or it will adjust your identity to match your behavior. This is why small wins matter. If you think of yourself as someone who is undisciplined, but you start waking up early for a week, showing up to the gym, or keeping a daily writing habit, your brain has to reconcile this conflict. Eventually, it updates its model of you. Maybe I am the kind of person who follows through. That's how identity shifts, not from positive thinking, but from repeated action. The opposite is also true. Every time you skip the habit, delay the work, or break a promise to yourself, you reinforce a different kind of identity. I'm someone who doesn't finish things. I can't rely on myself. This becomes dangerous over time, not just because it affects what you do, but because it shapes what you believe is possible for you. That's why consistency isn't just about productivity. It's about trust, the trust you build with yourself. When you consistently act in accordance with your goals, you begin to believe in your ability to handle hard things. That belief becomes the foundation for bigger and more meaningful commitments. One of the most effective ways to accelerate this process is to act as if. You don't wait until you fully believe in your new identity. You start by acting like the person you want to become. If you want to be a disciplined person, ask what would a disciplined person do right now? Then do that. Not tomorrow. Not when it feels easy, but now. The action comes first. The identity follows. This is how you override old patterns and rewire your self-perception from the inside out. Eventually, the behavior becomes less of a struggle, not because your environment changed, but because you changed. The gap between what I do and who I am closes. That's when consistency becomes effortless. You're not forcing yourself anymore because your actions are now an expression of your identity. This process is not overnight. It takes deliberate effort, repetition, and a willingness to persist even when the external results aren't immediate. But if you understand that every repetition is a neural vote for the person you are becoming, you stop needing external validation. You realize that the real win isn't just doing the task, it's becoming the kind of person who doesn't skip it. So if you want to be consistent, start by shifting the conversation from what do I want to achieve to who do I want to be? Then take action in alignment with that answer. Again and again, until the identity becomes your reality.